All right, folks, thanks for joining us back on Morning Line. Nick Barris here. No longer have to tap dance because our fine guests are here with us this morning. With us, as I said, is Murfreesboro's police chief. I say new police chief. He's been here now, what, about 6 months?
Coming up to 6 months.
About 6 months. A good time to have him back on. Police Chief Carl Jones. It's good to have you on, sir.
It's good being here.
I appreciate it. And with him, of course, his faithful sidekick, a friend of mine, and in my opinion, one of the best PIOs in the state of Tennessee, is Kyle Evans, Sergeant Kyle Evans with the Murfreesboro PD. Nice to have you on.
Good morning. Nice to be here.
So did you use your blue lights?
Absolutely not. It was tempting, but
the traffic. Every time you come on, there's a traffic jam.
And we took side streets, and it was just miserable coming up. It took us an hour and 45 minutes to get here.
Crazy. Yeah,
it felt like I was in Miami.
Yeah.
Really. I mean,
it's getting that way around here. The growth and everything. Listen, we've got the phone lines open. Prior to you getting here, if filling the time just before you did in the first segment, there was, as I mentioned to our viewers, overnight just basically massive violent protests in Charlotte, North Carolina last night. Overnight, just wrapped up the last few hours in reaction to another officer-involved shooting where there was an African-American shot in that situation. That comes on the heels of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma earlier this week. Thankfully, in this point, we've had some police-involved shootings. In fact, one yesterday in Metro that led to the death of someone, but it was justified the way it's played out. The race wasn't an issue there. But I'm wondering, Police Chief Anderson here, I think, takes a strong stand on how things are done properly. What do you tell your officers when they see these types of things happening and in the event that at some point something like this happens here?
But we've had a couple situations since I've been there where we were faced with an issue. The officers were, and they de-escalated the situation.
Right.
They justifiably could have shot somebody, and in fact,
there was. What was the one we talked about? That one. There have been a couple.
There have been several.
And I think it's all about the training of your officers, but in trying to de-escalate the situation. But then again, and I don't know what happened in Charlotte, but when somebody pulls a gun on an officer, you're not leaving them a lot of opportunities.
Right.
So I don't know what exactly happened in there, but I think what we need to do, and a councilman reached out to me on the way here and says, hey, we need to have some discussions in the community so that we can all talk about these issues so that they know that the community trusts us and that if something like this happens, we're going to fully look at it. And to examine the situation and bring the truth to light.
I guess I should know this in terms of there are video cameras in the squad cars, correct? I mean, video plays a role in a lot of this. We've seen some where the video justifies. I've seen some video where, I'm sorry, the officers were dead wrong. So what from your perspective, I mean, do you think video will play a key role? What do your officers have? They have the squad car cameras, right? Are they wearing body cameras sometimes or audio?
We have a couple of motor officers because we don't have in-car video cameras for the motorcycles. So.
Okay, right.
But most of our cars are equipped with in-car video, and that's aging out, and we're replacing that. So that's our priority is to get that video replaced. Some of our cars still have. I think we almost got rid of the last VHS ones.
Okay.
So yeah, I know. I mean, so
all right.
So that's our effort to try to so that we can present that evidence if there is a situation that happens, and it's just not an officer shooting, but other contacts that we have with the public.
It's invaluable sometimes to show what happens when maybe claims are made against your officers that are untrue. Right. And when you say de-escalate, by the way, when they arrive on a scene, and as you said, there have been a couple incidents. Obviously, when there's a weapon involved, you have limited options. But you're talking about negotiations. Try to talk it through.
Right. Right, you try to talk through the situation, and I can recall some of my own personal instances as a police officer that I could have rightfully shot somebody, and I don't think the public understands that our officers don't want to shoot somebody because it's traumatizing to that officer, the other officers, and we also know we don't want that person to die.
Resort.
So yeah, it's a last resort. But just going back and being able to try to slow things down and talk to that individual, try to talk them out of it, talk them to go another course of action, and it doesn't always work.
I wanted to ask you this one part. Do you see the perception out there to some degree too with regard to, depending on the person, an African American who's pulled over these days, and if you ask a lot of them, they unfortunately in a lot of cases view officers with distrust or adversarial. Not everyone, but they do. And so as a result, a lot of times when these things happen, people will say, well, if you just cooperate and do what the officer does, which you should do. When an officer issues a command, deal with it. If he's right or wrong, you can explore that later in a court. But do officers understand that, if I'm pulled over, I'm Caucasian, never had a problem, I'm going to comply. But that an African American pulled over, depending on his prior experience, may not be as eager to comply with everything simply because they distrust and aren't sure what's going to happen next, and that the officer's aware of that, so maybe they approach that with a little more restraint. You know what I'm saying? Because that is a reality, and if officers aren't aware of it, they better get aware of it.
We've had training in the agency through Noble, but that doesn't mean it stops there. When I was just recently in Washington, D.C., one of the things that we have to really look at is implicit bias, because we all have biases, and what the problem is when you act on those biases, when you let them influence your decision making. And that's what we have to train our officers for, is to have them examine what their own implicit biases are and manage those and try to lessen them or get rid of them.
Yeah.
So, but we have to bring that to conscious. But this isn't just law enforcement. This is, this is the whole society, because you think about the judicial system. Judges, attorneys have implicit bias. Is that affecting their decision making? Unfortunately, we look at the social injustices that we see in our society, but we label them to the police officer because they're the ones in the uniform that are on the front line. And we want to blame them for everything. But there's a lot more behind the scenes that we have to examine as society to try to fix.
I agree. Listen, we're going to get to calls in a moment, but Kyle mentioned to me too, and you just touched on it. I guess he was in charge while you were gone. But you were in Washington, D.C., and I know that sheriffs had been out there to D.C. Is this the conference on what that you were just there for?
It was a debriefing of the 21st century policing.
Okay. So, meaning, is it focused on what, just new techniques, new technologies?
Well, the President Obama had a task force that came up with the best practices of law enforcement, and they came up with 6 pillars of what law enforcement should be moving to move ahead and to become best practices. I think that was different than a sheriff's conference. So this this was developed at President Obama's executive order, and they came up with a guideline, and we're using this as a template to try to model our agency as the best practices.
What did you take away? Yeah, for instance, what?
For instance, examination of our data to take a look at our implicit bias. That's one of it. But the other thing is officer wellness is a piece of it too. So it's just not policing practices, but we got to take a look at the wellness of our officers. The thing I worry about is these officers involved in daily traumatic incidents. And what are we doing? Because we understand what war does to people, but what is this constant barrage of, and how is this tearing up our officers' lives? Because we hear about our police officers having going through a lot of divorces, and it's been well known. We have high suicide rates that law enforcement doesn't talk about, but it's true. But so we've got to have a better understanding, and this 21st century policing called for Congress and stuff to identify money to start doing this type of research too. So there's practices for law enforcement, but there's also this global thing of, hey, we got a lot of work to do.
That makes perfect sense when you think about it. Law enforcement every day out in these situations, and of late, it wasn't so long ago that police officers, and I hope it doesn't start again, were being targeted. That. I mean, what we saw happening in Texas and all of that. But when they are under that much stress, sometimes when we see these incidents where maybe they go over the top, it's really easy to say in that vacuum, you're like, well, they went too far. And they did probably in that case. But I sometimes think to myself, after all they've been through, this is where finally, maybe because they do need the help you're talking about, they just burst. You know what I'm saying? Well, I mean, it's just, they've got the professional training, but the stress and stress and stress and stress, facing the dangers they face every day. And I'm not trying to make excuses for them. I'm trying to explain maybe why sometimes they go too far.
Well, again, I think we have so much to learn, but, the example that was discussed up there is an officer that goes to child death. A very traumatizing situation. I mean, you're talking about grieving parents, emotional, if that officer has their own child. And then as soon as they clear that, they're now going to domestic in progress. They've had no time to decompress, and now they're going back. What is this doing to our officers? And we got to sustain these officers for a 25, 30-year career. So that we've really got to take a look at that and officer wellness, and that's one of the areas that I'm pushing into. Because you look at some of our officers, and I can speak for myself, a little overweight, and it's not conducive. I mean, it's known that law enforcement, yeah, I can admit it.
No,
it's not from donuts, though. It's not from donuts. I know you're going to go there.
I was going to say that.
Yeah, you were.
Okay.
Yeah, you were.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. No, but you're right. It's physical as well as mental.
Yeah.
Right? It's both parts of that. Hey, let's take a quick phone call before we take one of our breaks here. Let's go to Joe. I think we got Joe on line 1. Joe, good morning.
Good morning, Nick.
Hey, Joe.
And your panel there. I think the general public needs to understand that officers are human beings, and they're in a high-stress job, especially in this day and time. And you have a very, very narrow time period when you stop somebody or confront somebody to make a decision on what you're going to do and how you're going to handle it. People do not, the biggest problem we got now is people do not comply. When an officer stops you, do what they say. Don't try to be combative, and when they tell you to get out of the car or don't get out of the car, whatever they tell you to do is to do. And don't be reaching for anything, because officers are on the edge themselves right now. So if you reach for something or you act like you've got something, you better be careful, because there's a good chance that you're going to be shot. In Nashville and in Tennessee here, the last 2 guys got shot were white. Both had high criminal records. One of them had just got out of prison in 2014. So they knew what they were doing. The officer in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that shot the guy was a lady, and she'd already tasered the guy, and he still wouldn't comply and was giving her problems. So, she was on edge. He did something to make her do what she did, I'm sure.
Well, is it when an officer is pulling a weapon, they should do so under only what circumstance? What's the circumstance to pull a weapon out? It's the last resort, but you would pull that out only because you perceive a potentially deadly threat? Is that it?
No, I'm going to kick, just because I've been talking so much, I'm going to kick this one to Kyle.
Okay, Kyle, go ahead.
Well, absolutely. I think no police officer goes into any situation thinking that they're wanting to use deadly force or that they're going to want to use a weapon. So, it's really to protect themselves or to protect innocent third parties. And so many times there's someone that intends to do harm to a third party, and the officer has to find a way to stop them from doing that. And as Chief Durr mentioned earlier, we are trained to de-escalate situations first and foremost, and only as a last resort would an officer result to using a weapon or deadly force. So, but Joe brings up an interesting question about when you're on a traffic stop. I can remember when I was in traffic, and a lot of folks would get out of their car and come and meet the police officer, and police officers are trained to keep people inside the vehicle, but that wasn't always the case. It was a sign of respect at a certain point that you would get out and go back to the officer, whereas today, officers want to keep people inside their car so they don't get run over by traffic, or just it's kind of the safest for both the officer and the person in the car. So things have really changed a lot, and we work really hard to train our police officers to find ways other than yelling at someone, hey, get back in the car, or things that would escalate the situation. We train our police officers from day one, when the first day they start through the training program and through continuing education, that there are other ways to bring calm and peace to every situation that they come into. Sometimes they just can't, and that's what unfortunately we have in cases like what happened in Metro and in Decatur County. Yeah,
okay, exactly, in both those cases, and there were weapons involved in both those cases, Kyle. But when a person is not complying with an officer's commands, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to pull their weapon right there on the spot.
Right. The officer is usually, and I'll speak for myself, you're measuring the intensity and the behaviors of the individual.
It's subjective. It really is. Yeah.
I've seen people when I walk up to the car for a traffic stop, and they're reaching under the seat. Is that a gun, or are they reaching for their wallet?
Yeah, well, I understand. That's
because
scary.
Because if you think about it, most people that are carrying guns in the car are carrying it on the front seat. So what people don't understand is we can see a lot as we walk up to that car. We're trained. We take our time walking up to that car, and we're constantly evaluating what is happening inside that vehicle, because it is such an intense moment walking up there. And I think at that point you got a heightened officer. You got the passenger, the driver of the car, that's probably worried they're going to get a ticket, or if they got a warrant for the arrest, or whatever that's going on. And you have, I think, this point of time where there's some real conflict.
Yep.
And we've got to work through that and de-escalate it. So I think, we train our officers that, hey, that's going to be a heightened sensitive situation. We need to make it be a calming presence in that point.
And that's at every darn traffic stop. You're absolutely right. I just think how many are done? Thousands every day. And every single one is a scary situation because you just don't know. It's an unknown. Yeah. All right, listen, we'll take a break on that note. We get chiefs on here sometimes, and they don't get a ton of calls, but you do. So we're going to take a break, and we'll be back with more phone calls, more of our conversation with Murfreesboro Police Chief Carl Durr and Sergeant Kyle Evans right after this. Stay with us.